Welcome back to ILTV News. More than 465 days in Hamas captivity. That has been the experience of 98 remaining hostages in Gaza. Right now, all of Israel is on the edge of their seats, waiting for the return of our hostages. As we report on the latest, we have ILTV's Ariella Lachiani in the field, as well as our correspondent Shoshbed Rosian reporting on the latest results of these negotiations. We'll be hearing from them shortly, but to start, the ceasefire hostage deal remains on the brink of finalization. Most recent reports just coming in indicate that the agreement is expected to be signed tonight in Doha. Hamas had reportedly agreed to the basic terms this afternoon, and amid the agonizing wait for the release of hostages, teams in Doha are attempting to close any remaining details. We have more from ILTV's Steve Leibowitz.
The story is still developing, but Hamas has reportedly agreed to the hostage for ceasefire agreement, and a signing of the mediated deal could come later tonight in Doha. Reports from Doha also indicate that if the deal is signed tonight, the first small group of Israeli hostages could come home as early as Sunday. Earlier, the Qatari foreign minister said this.
تأكيد طبعا نعم أنه تم تسليم المسودات إلى الطرفين. نعم تم تذليل الصعوبات أمام القضايا الرئيسية العالقة بين الطرفين، ونعم تجري الآن المحادثات حول التفاصيل النهائية، ولكن لا يمكننا إعطاء أي تفاصيل حول طبيعة هذه التفاصيل التي تتحدث عنها أو أين تقف اليوم هذه المحادثات، إلا أن نقول أننا تجاوزنا العقبات الرئيسية في خلافات بين الطرفين.
Hamas did say that the Doha talks had reached their final stage, and it informed other Palestinian factions of progress made so far. Some of the hostages are being held by Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Saudi reports say Hamas had started dividing the hostages into groups ahead of their expected release. Qatar said the sides were at the closest point yet to a deal. Hamas and the other factions are believed to be holding 98 hostages, including the bodies of at least 36 confirmed dead by Israel. The three phases would reportedly begin with the gradual release of 33 hostages over a 6-week period, with talks on a second phase of releases due to begin on day 16 of the agreement.
With the hostage for ceasefire deal close at hand, Prime Minister Netanyahu met with families of the captives, demanding freedom for all of their loved ones, and also met with far right-wing ministers opposing the deal and threatening to bolt from the coalition government. Prime Minister Netanyahu met with Finance Minister Smotrich and National Security Minister Ben-Gvir to keep them in his coalition government despite their opposition to the ceasefire deal. Ben-Gvir is sounding defiant.
אם הוא מעביר את העסקה, אנחנו פורשים מהממשלה. אני מדגיש, גם אם נהיה באופוזיציה לא נפיל את נתניהו. אבל השיתוף פעולה הזה זו הדרך היחידה שלנו למנוע את עסקת הכניעה, למנוע את העסקה הנוראית הזאת, ולדאוג לכך שמותם של מאות חיילים לא יהיה לשווא.
Netanyahu told the families of hostages that pending the Hamas agreement, the deal could be signed at any moment.
We have just come out of a meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. We know that the next few hours are critical and time is of the essence. And we want to be very optimistic that within the few days, even hours, we can get to an agreement that will start saving lives and getting hostages, dead or alive, back home.
The families expressed concern that the deal will include 3 phases of hostage release, but the current agreements only relate to the first stage. According to the agreement, talks on the next stage begin only after the 16th day of the agreement, so that none of the 98 hostages are left behind.
It's time for a deal that includes everybody. That is what we demand and what we expect from the Prime Minister. My son is a hero and saved many, many people. He doesn't deserve to rot in Gaza.
Well, Israel's hospitals are readying themselves to welcome hostages released from Hamas captivity as the country anxiously awaits. ILTV's Ariella Lachiani is joining us now from ILTV Hospital in Tel Aviv. Ariella, what can you tell us about what's happening?
Yes, thank you, Emily. So ILTV Hospital, which is just behind me now, and also Sheba Medical Center have spent weeks preparing to receive hostages with comprehensive care. Following health ministry protocols, each returning hostage will receive a private room and also, of course, dedicated attention from a team of doctors, nurses and social workers. Now, medical assessments will include thorough physical exams, blood tests, any scans to address injury, malnutrition, any infection endured during captivity, and of course psychological evaluations and emotional support will be provided continuously. Now, in addition, female hostages will receive discreet checks for potential sexual abuse, which will include pregnancy tests if necessary, which is of course an unbelievably harrowing thought to hold. However, medical professionals must be prepared for any possibility. We actually spoke earlier with Professor Hagai Levine, the head of the health team for the Hostages Families Forum, to hear more about this.
We have to be very vigilant and humble. We don't know in what condition the hostages will arrive. We have to be prepared for any possibilities. So we will need to check the different possibilities and first and above all to bring back their humanity, because they were dehumanized for over 15 months. So we have to be with them and professionally treat them for long-term rehabilitation.
The emotions of the hostage deal can be felt throughout all of Israel, with mixed thoughts on how it should be handled. ILTV's Shosh Bedrosian is at the Nova Music Festival site, Re'im, where dozens of Israelis were kidnapped on October 7th, including 24-year-old Romi Gonen, who is expected to be among the first group of hostages released. Shosh, thank you for joining. What can you tell us about the scenes in Re'im today?
We're here at the Nova Music Festival site, pretty much the ground zero of October 7th. You can still hear the booming and the popping sounds since we're about 3 miles from the border of Gaza. About 40 people were taken captive here by Hamas terrorists, and dozens of them are still in captivity. So many of their families are just hoping that they come out in this deal. 40 hostages were taken from the Nova Music Festival. 4 of them were rescued alive by the IDF and special forces, and several have been declared dead while in captivity. A festival that brought immense joy became the scene of a horror movie and battleground that became a prominent event between Hamas and Israel on October 7th. Residents from Israel still travel here every day to pay their respects to the victims and captives.
When I see here all the other young people, young souls that were killed here, it feels terrible. It's our second Holocaust. This is what I feel today.
What is it like for you to know that Israel and Hamas are on the brink of cutting a hostage deal?
What the Hamas do this whole more than 400 days under the tunnels of in the ground to our hostage is not human. I pray for a whole deal that everyone would come back home. I pray for the safe of their soul and body. And I think that all the Jewish people, this is the one thing that we all want more than everything in the world.
It's unclear which hostages will come out of this deal in the first phase, and if it will include any of the Nova survivors still in hostage captivity, but we will have all of the updates on ILTV.
Thank you, Shosh. Now, just ahead of the inauguration of President Trump on Wednesday, current U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken revealed his plan for the day after in Gaza. Let's take a look. On Wednesday, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken presented a plan for post-war Gaza and emphasized the importance of not leaving a power vacuum in the enclave. In his address, Blinken defended the Biden administration's support for Israel during the war, prompting multiple disruptions from anti-Israel protesters, shouting, "Bloody Blinken." Regarding governance of the Gaza Strip, Blinken called for the Palestinian Authority to work with international partners to establish an interim administration in Gaza overseeing civil sectors that would have funding, technical support, and oversight from the international community. Blinken specifically noted that the new administrator should work closely with the UN, who should oversee internal stabilization and recovery. In regards to security, Blinken called for partner nations to provide forces and work with vetted Palestinian personnel to ensure a secure environment and prevent the rebuilding of Hamas, whom he alleged has recruited as many fighters as Israel has killed during the current war. The issue of the Palestinian state was also raised, with Blinken noting that the unification of Gaza and the West Bank under the PA must be done as part of a pathway to a Palestinian state, yet with the caveat that no one should expect Israel to recognize a Palestinian state that's led by Hamas or other terrorists. While Blinken made no reference to the fact the Palestinian Authority continues to pay terrorists for their acts of violence, he did accuse Israel of undermining the PA by withholding tax revenue over the issue, claiming it's important to essential services for Palestinians. Blinken, whose term ends in a number of days, stated that the plan would be given to the Trump administration, but that there is no indication they intend to pursue this plan. Well, now joining us to discuss what comes next in Gaza and for Israel is Dr. Einat Wilf, a former MK and the author of The War of Return. Einat, thank you for joining us today. To start, what is your response to Secretary Blinken's proposed plan to have the Palestinian Authority take over Gaza along with international support? Is there any alternative even?
This is still stuck in the past. I think we would have learned by now that the problem has never been just Hamas or this. The problem is Palestinianism as an identity, as an ideology that is organized, that tragically organized an entire people over the obsession of the non-existence of a Jewish state. Hamas is merely the most brutal and recent executive arm of Palestinianism, but the Palestinian Authority shares the same vision of no Jewish state. It merely has come to believe that it is better to execute this vision by trying to turn Israel into a pariah state diplomatically and in various forums, but it does not it does not have a different goal for the people. So I would think that someone would finally get it, certainly among the American administration, that you can't want for the Palestinians a state which they've never wanted for themselves if it has to live next to a Jewish state. So why don't we first find out that Palestinianism as an ideology is gone, and then we can talk about building something.
Now, can you share a little bit more about the Palestinian Authority, some of the challenges that they're facing in general when it comes to governance? I mean, they barely have control over the West Bank as it is. And also from an Israeli perspective, how could Israel rely on a government that continues to pay terrorists in the West Bank?
Those are just ultimately the expressions of the fact that the Palestinian Authority is not really an alternative to Hamas in any meaningful sense. It is not an alternative in terms of really trying to build a state. Why don't they have a state? They don't have a state because they never tried to get one, not if it lives next to a Jewish state. So Hamas remains hugely popular in the West Bank, and it's hugely popular because, again, people are excited about what Hamas did. They're excited about the fact that it is still left standing after having committed October 7th. The Palestinian Authority has never kind of removed itself from October 7th or Hamas. They merely expressed annoyance that it was done without their approval, but they never challenged the underlying theme that there should be no Jewish state. So they're not an alternative in any meaningful sense for people who are trying to actually achieve peace. If you're trying to pretend you're doing something, then sure. But if you're actually serious, they're not an alternative.
Now, one of the things that Secretary Blinken also mentioned was UN involvement with a senior UN official to help oversee security and rebuilding. Now, obviously, we've seen how, in some cases, that's even more damaging, looking at UNIFIL in Lebanon, or, of course, UNRWA in the West Bank and Gaza, as you are an expert on. How does Israel ensure that Hamas terrorists or other terror groups aren't rebuilding if the international bodies like the UN are in charge of protecting Gaza?
There's no way to do that, and you're absolutely right that it's even worse, because what we've seen with UNIFIL, with UNRWA, is that because people actually think that the hallowed letters UN means something, it actually limits the ability certainly for Israel to battle its enemies. Hezbollah built at our doorstep the mechanism for our annihilation. We know what they built in the north was 1,000 times what Hamas built in Gaza, and what Hamas built in Gaza was 1,000 times worse than our worst nightmares. So, and in the north, it was built under the camouflage of UNIFIL. In Gaza, it was built with the camouflage of UNRWA, but it's merely camouflage. So better not to have camouflage and actually know who your enemy is. The only way to ensure that nothing evil is being rebuilt in Gaza is to actually insist that the ideology of Palestinianism, the ideology, not the people, dies. And the ideology has 4 tenets: from the river to the sea, no Jewish state, perpetual refugeehood, and return. And only once we can be certain that that ideology and identity is no longer fueled, sustained, and no longer is the ideology of the Arabs in Gaza and the West Bank, then we can actually talk about having peace.
Now, finally, Israel is moving forward with some kind of a hostage deal, not completely finalized yet. What's your take? Is this a good deal? Is there even another choice?
So those are 2 different things, unfortunately. Of course, it's not a good deal in the sense that even the idea that Israel has to negotiate the release of people who were kidnapped from their beds on a Shabbat morning, that Israel has to negotiate with those who have invaded and violated Israeli sovereignty, that already is a terrible message. And it's a terrible message that has been normalized for months. It's, again, people pretended that Qatar is some lovely mediator rather than the vile country that it is. And it's been successfully, unfortunately, working 24/7 on securing the ability of Hamas to basically emerge from October 7 unscathed. So, of course, it's terrible. The message should have been from day one, Israel owes you nothing, and you release the hostages, or, I mean, Israel does not need to supply you. It does not need to supply its enemy while the enemy holds its hostages, and we will give everything that Israel needs to unequivocally win until you surrender and release the hostages. So clearly that would have been the better one. But 15 months after, when so many around the world have normalized the idea that Israel must negotiate and cave in to its enemies, then the question is there any other choice to get our people? And at this point, and here I also have massive criticism of our government, which is marked by big words and zero capability, is that they have brought us to a situation where basically there doesn't seem to be any other choice. I would only say, to the extent that any slim choice does remain, I would insist that the one thing that Hamas wants above all, which is the return of people to the north, we know that this is really something they want, that this will not happen within the first week, that this will only happen after all hostages, every single one of them, are returned.
All right. Well, thank you for your insight on those issues. We're hoping for the best in the return of these hostages and with some kind of deal that can at least get some of them home, even if it's not the best deal, as you mentioned. Thank you so much for joining us today. And now I'd like to invite you to the next ILTV community webinar. This exclusive event gives our paid subscribers a unique opportunity to connect directly with our editor, Steve Leibowitz. You'll have the chance to ask questions about the news and discuss the issues that matter most to you. As you know, Steve is a veteran Israeli journalist who has been covering Israeli news since the days of Prime Minister Begin, and he leads the team that decides what makes it into our news show here each day. Don't miss this webinar. It's an event you'll definitely want to be a part of. The hostage for ceasefire deal includes the release of some of the most notorious Palestinian terrorists serving sentences in Israel. While the number and names of the prisoners has yet to be announced, all are aware of the dangers presented by hundreds of convicted terrorists being set free. We have more from ILTV's Steve Leibowitz.
Hamas has submitted a list of prisoners it's demanding in exchange for the hostages, but at this stage it remains unclear which of the leading arch-terrorists could be included. It is known that Hamas submitted the names of dozens of senior terrorists convicted of the murder of Israelis who are serving life sentences. According to a Saudi report, Hamas is also demanding the body of its leader, Yahya Sinwar, who was killed by an IDF strike. Hamas is demanding freedom for a number of top terrorist leaders that Israel refused to set free in the deal for the release of Gilad Shalit in 2011. Those include Abdullah Barghouti, a Hamas terrorist and commander of its military wing in Judea and Samaria, Marwan Barghouti, a former Fatah Secretary General, convicted for the murder of 5 Israelis, Ahmed Sadat, the Secretary General of the Popular Front Movement and planner of the assassination of Israeli Minister Rehavam Ze'evi, and Ibrahim Khalid, the mastermind of the suicide bombing campaign of the Second Intifada. Yahya Sinwar and many of the Hamas commanders who planned and carried out the October 7th massacre were released in the deal to free Shalit. Israelis are rightly concerned that many of those freed will return to lives of terror. This is part of the price to pay for the return of the hostages. According to local polls, a majority of Israelis are willing to take that risk.
As Israel and the world continues to pressure the Islamic regime in Iran over their rogue nuclear program, a new interview has brought forth new revelations about Israel's sabotage of the regime on the ground. In an interview from Iran with Mohammad Zarif, the Islamic regime's vice president and former foreign minister, he revealed for the first time that Israel has planted explosives on Iran's nuclear centrifuges, but did not mention when this incident took place or when the regime became aware of it. Zarif added that the explosives were discovered embedded in centrifuge components purchased by the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, and that they were located and disposed of by the regime. Zarif claimed that sanctions made the regime vulnerable to what he called Israeli traps, forcing them to rely on intermediaries for their equipment, which Israel had successfully infiltrated, much like the pager attack on Hezbollah operatives in Lebanon. In 2021, a power failure at Natanz nuclear facility caused by an explosion was dubbed an act of nuclear terrorism by the Islamic regime, but it is unclear if the event had any association to the explosives planted by Israel. Israel also did not claim credit for the incident. With the transition of President-elect Trump, the regime is expecting another blow with the re-implementation of sanctions. The previous Trump administration sanctions almost crippled the Iranian economy, and under Trump's tenure, executions, oil exports, funding to terror proxies, and nuclear enrichment were all decreased in Iran. Nearly half the world's adult population holds anti-Semitic views. That's the finding from a worldwide survey conducted by the ADL. 46% harbor anti-Jewish views, translating to 2.2 billion people worldwide. The global survey asked respondents in 103 countries if they agreed with anti-Semitic tropes, like Jews having too much influence in the business world. 20% of respondents never heard of the Holocaust, and anti-Semitic views were found to be higher in younger adults. The level of anti-Semitism varied from country to country, with the Middle East and North Africa having the highest levels of Jew hatred. Iran was ranked the least anti-Semitic country of the 18 countries in the region, with 49% holding significant anti-Jewish views. On the positive side, 57% of respondents said that a hatred of Jews was a serious problem, and 67% oppose boycotts of Israel. And now let's take a look at the weather forecast. Partly cloudy skies are expected around most of the country tonight, with temperatures reaching lows of around 12 degrees Celsius or 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Then tomorrow we'll see more cloudy skies alongside steady temperatures, seeing highs of about 20 degrees Celsius or 67 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a wrap for today's news. Let us hope and pray that after more than 460 days, we'll see the return of our hostages as early as the end of this week. As always, be sure to follow our ILTV channel, subscribe to our newsletter, and explore our website, ILTV.tv, to stay informed with the latest news straight from the heart of Israel. I'm Emily Schrader. Be well, and thank you for watching.